This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now a little while ago I made a video that was titled Happy Wholesome Books to Read While You're Sad. Today's video is going to be the complete antithesis of that because it's going to be all about books that ripped my heart to shreds. Now these are going to be books that mostly made me bawl my eyes out. There's some books on here that didn't quite make me cry, but they still elicited like a really big emotional reaction from me. They left me feeling a bit hollow and dead inside. And for some reason, these are the types of books I tend to love the most. Like if there is a book that can rip my heart to shreds, make me absolutely bawl my eyes out and leave me thinking about it for weeks or months after I finished reading, that is a 5-star book. That is a book I'm going to love to pieces. Let's jump into the video. These are going to be 10 books that absolutely ripped my heart to shreds. The very first book I want to talk about is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. This book is a little bit topical for me because I'm currently reading Clara and the Sun. This book I read when I was in year 12. It was a part of my English syllabus. I had to read it. This is an absolute tearjerker. I remember just weeping and bawling my eyes out at the end of this story. It is so emotional and I felt so attached to the characters, and this book asks a lot of big life questions that make you feel very emotional. Now the sort of high level premise of the book is that we have our main character whose name is Kathy H. She starts off in a boarding school and it is effectively about her life. Story of love, friendship and memory, but pretty much it starts out at like an idyllic English boarding school and then it follows on from there. There's a lot of twists and turns with this one. It's really hard to explain the plot without giving it away, and I recommend you go read it because it is absolutely devastating and it will rip your heart to shreds. I've watched the movie. The movie is also devastating. Just a really good book if you want to cry profusely. The second book on this list might come as a little bit of a shock because it was actually on my Happy Wholesome Book Recommendations video, and that is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. Now, this book overall is quite an uplifting book. Like if I had to put it into a category of makes me feel sad overall or makes me feel happy overall, I would say it makes me feel really, really happy and joyful overall. However, there are parts of this book that are kind of soul crushing, and there are parts of this book that made me just weep because it was so adorable and bits of it were so sad and raw, and it's honestly such a beautiful story, but it did make me absolutely cry my eyes out, which is why it's going on this list. For those of you who have watched a lot of my recent videos, you're probably sick to death of me talking about this particular book, but it is just a testament to how much I love this story that I keep recommending it over and over again. The main character of this book is named Linus Baker, and he is a caseworker for the department in charge of magical youth. He is, at the beginning of the story, very sad and incredibly lonely, and it's his job to go to the orphanages that contain and exclude from society the magical children of this world, and he sees if the orphanages are up to scratch, if they need to be shut down. He gets this special assignment to go to this orphanage on an island which is in the titular Cerulean Sea, where he meets a bunch of children and their caretaker, and the story sort of follows on from there. The reason why this book is so gut-wrenching and devastating is that it's a really raw story about love and about fatherly love and about people being excluded from society and people's prejudice. The way Linus is explored is some of the best characterization I've ever read. Like I would die for Linus. I love him so much. He is such a wholesome, good character and he felt so real. I'm probably going to keep recommending it until the end of time, so I'm sorry about that. But yes, this one did make me cry quite a bit. It's a very good book. I definitely recommend it. Book number 3 is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This is one of the most beautiful stories I have ever read in my life. I love Anthony Doerr's writing. I think this book is genuinely so beautifully written. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2015 and it absolutely deserves that award. This story follows 2 children during World War II. Marie Laure, who is blind, she lives in Paris, and it also follows Werner, who is an orphan who lives in Germany. And this is a really fragmentary story that's not chronological, so it goes back and forth between their stories and back and forth through time. I feel like any book that's set during a war is probably, like you can probably guess it's going to be quite sad, and it ripped my heart to shreds in amongst these scenes of really beautiful storytelling. The imagery imagery in this book is just stunning, and the way the author explores the historical setting, like you can tell he's done quite a lot of research and it feels very authentic and realistic, which contributes to the fact that it's absolutely soul crushing and it made me cry very, very much. I love this story to pieces and it is one of my favorite books of all time, but definitely a tearjerker. The fourth book on this list is Atonement by Ian McEwan. Atonement is another war story, so this one I believe is set during World War II as well, and naturally it is a really, really sad book. Now the movie for this book is also excellent. I think I watched the movie first before reading the book. Bawled my eyes out in both of them, like very, very sad across the board. The movie also has like baby Saoirse Ronan in it. She plays the character of Bryony. The high level premise of this story is that we have our main character whose name is Bryony. She is a child at the beginning of the story. I think it starts off in 1935. Bryony is at her home. She sees something happen that she doesn't quite understand. She thinks she understands it, but she really 100% doesn't. And then she accidentally tells a lie to some very important people, and the lie that she tells have dire and horrible consequences on people that she cares about. And this story sort of follows Bryony's life and the implication of what she did as a child, the implication of her interpretation of the events, and her atoning for what she did. And so it's about guilt, it's about the horrors of war. I love that the story is very colored by Bryony's perspective, and the ending of this story is told in such a way that it tears your heart to pieces, but you don't expect it. The way the narration of this story is told is just masterful and beautiful, and yes, absolutely devastating. Before we dive into the next book, I just wanted to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is a website builder which enables people to create dynamic and stunning websites. Most of you would know by now that my website is built through Squarespace. I really loved how easy it was to design the site, how much control I had, and the enormous selection of wonderful templates. Building your website is as simple as dragging and dropping in the elements and structures that you want. Squarespace has in-depth analytics tools which help you to understand the people who are visiting your website. It also has powerful blogging tools, making it excellent at helping people to show off their work and connect with those who are interested in the things that they make. If you're looking to make a website, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/ChristyAnnJones to save 10% off your purchase of a website or domain. Book number 5 on this list is The Traveling Cat Chronicles by Hiro Arikawa. This is a story that I did not expect to be devastating. I did not expect to have my heart absolutely stamped on by the author again and again and again. I listened to this as an audiobook, and there was this one day that I was sitting at my desk at work eating my lunch listening to this book, and I had such a massive emotional response. I was actually crying at my desk, and I had to actually switch the book off because I was crying that much. And I was like, if someone walks up to me at my desk right now just eating my salad or whatever and bawling my eyes out, they're gonna be like, what are you doing? It is so gloriously devastating. I absolutely love this book. This story is really cool because it's told from the perspective of the cat in the story. You can tell with the sass and the sort of mild smugness of the narrative voice that it really does feel like a cat. The name of the cat is Nana because his tail is shaped like the Japanese character for 7. The main character's name is Satoru, and he is trying to find a new home for his beloved cat. He's driving around the countryside. There's some really beautiful natural imagery of Japan in this story that I really loved. But yes, basically we start off the story as Satoru is driving around trying to find a new home for Nana. And we go and meet all these people who have been really important to Satoru over the course of his life. Very engaged with the story. It was absolutely devastating and I love it to bits. Book number 6 on this list might be a little bit more specific to me. Don't know if this is the type of book that's going to make everyone cry, but I cried quite a bit while reading this, and this is The Invention of Angela Carter by Edmund Gordon. This is a biography of Angela Carter's life, and she died upsettingly young from lung cancer. I think she was in her 50s or something like that. Probably I should lead with the fact that Angela Carter is one of my favorite authors of all time. She is a writer of some really interesting and beautiful stories. She writes a lot of gothic, a lot of magical realism, and a lot of fairy tale centric works. She was just such an amazing talent, and it's really devastating that she died so young because she probably had so many more wonderful and amazing stories in her left to write. And she had a small son who was, I think, about about 8-ish years old, maybe 6 years old at the time. Just the ending and how sad it was and how quick it was and the tragedy of it. This book made me cry quite a lot, which I wasn't expecting. This is a brilliantly written memoir and I really love it. Number 7 on this list is actually a whole book series, and it is the 5th season series by N.K. Jemisin. I think this is the only book on this list where I didn't actually quite cry. However, this book is devastating and there's so many oofed moments the whole way through. I feel like the whole way through the story, you're just sort of, your heart is getting tread on over and over and over again. Beautifully written, and I felt so emotionally connected to the characters. So this book is sort of an amalgamation of like a dystopian fantasy sci-fi novel. It has some really glorious world building. Like the world here is so fleshed out. It's some of the best world building I've ever read. The first book in the series is told from a number of different perspectives, but we start off with Essen, whose son has been murdered and her daughter has been kidnapped. Pretty much we're sort of at the point where this is the end of the world and we're in a sort of like catastrophic situation, but our main character doesn't care about that because she's determined to go and find her daughter. There's so much more to the story than that very, very shallow explanation I just gave. Pretty much this series just doesn't pull its punches. It is so devastating in so many different ways throughout the whole story. I really loved it. I never wanted it to end, and it's such a fantastic, gritty, fantasy, speculative story that doesn't really fit into any one box. Definitely recommend it if you want to feel like your heart is being run over again and again and again. Number 8 on this list is another non-fiction book, and this is Educated by Tara Westover. This is another book I've talked about quite a bit on this channel, and it is another book that really, really surprised me because I didn't expect to absolutely bawl my eyes out while listening to this book. This is a story about Tara, who grew up in a very sort of extreme Mormon family in the US. But Tara grows up in a situation in which she is never allowed to go to school, she is not allowed to go to doctors, her family believe the ends of days are coming, and they are very controlling and manipulative of what Tara is and isn't allowed to do. The father of the family is particularly controlling, and this story is fundamentally about Tara and her journey in terms of how she claws herself in education. Even though she never goes to primary school or high school, she ends up graduating from a really prestigious college, and the book follows her journey as she unlearns all of these things that she was taught during her childhood, and as she starts to advocate for herself and believe that she deserves help as she starts to integrate into society. I just found this story so incredibly interesting, and I think I just found this book really compelling and I loved it. And again, the same thing with the Angela Carter book. I think I found it more upsetting and more emotional because I knew it was real. I knew it had actually happened to someone. Book number 10 on this list is The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. This one might also come as a shock in the same way that The House in the Cerulean Sea came as a shock, because I think this was also on my comforting books list. This one isn't devastating in terms of it being tragic, but it did make me cry quite a bit. I think because I found it such a compelling story, and I think it's a really eloquent exploration of childhood and growing up. This story follows Bod. His name is short for nobody, and at the beginning of the book he is a toddler whose family is sort of like violently murdered by this scary antagonistic figure named Jack. Now Bod manages to narrowly avoid this tragedy. He toddles off out of the house and up the hill to the local graveyard, and the ghosts of the graveyard save him from the man who wants to kill him. Bod is then subsequently raised by the ghosts of the graveyard, and the story is kind of like an episodic journey through Bod's childhood, and it navigates the adventures of his childhood as he lives in the graveyard. So the graveyard of this story very much represents Bod's childhood, and the world outside the graveyard represents his adulthood. And as we go through the story, Bod navigates this like liminal space between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and the fact that he will eventually have to join the adult world outside the graveyard. And I think the thing that made me tear up quite a bit while reading this story at the very end is just that A, it's an incredibly beautiful story. I think Neil Gaiman is such a magical writer and he's one of my favorite writers of all time. And B, I think there is like a certain element of tragedy to like growing up and to leaving behind one's childhood, and the fact that once you exit your childhood you can't really go back. I think it's a really beautiful story, and although this is again overall sort of a cozy uplifting book, I cried at the end of this story. I thought it was just really beautiful. And then finally, the very last book on this list is the most devastating book I have ever read in my entire life, and it is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. Now, for those of you who have watched a lot of my videos, this will absolutely not come as a surprise because I never shut up about this book. I love it so incredibly much, and it is just devastating. Like, to the point where I read this book well over a year ago, and I still think about the big sad thing that happened in this book. Like, it's just, it was so devastating, and it came out of nowhere, and I wasn't expecting it. And I won't give away anything because I don't want to in any way inhibit the full impact of the tragedy in this story, but it is just gloriously written, and the tragedy of the story is written in such a way that it ties itself back to the key themes of the book. Like, I sobbed reading this book. It was so sad, and I loved it so very much. The main character of this book is named Sunja. This is set at the sort of like beginning of the 1900s when the story begins. Sunja is 16 years old, and she is pregnant and unmarried, and so she ends up being wed to a Christian pastor whose name is Isaac, who is going to take her across the sea, where Isaac is going to work in his brother's church in Osaka. This is set during a time where it was very hostile for Korean people to live in Japan. It begins in 1911 in Yeongdo, and then we follow the journey the whole way through over the course of many decades, and the way that technology is introduced and the way the setting changes and how many characters we get introduced to over the course of Sunja's life. I think this is just an enormous story, and it's so epic and tragic and beautiful. I loved all the characters. I felt so tied to all of the characters. And yes, fundamentally, this story just absolutely ripped my heart to shreds and stomped all over it. Like, it's so sad and so gut-wrenching, but in the most glorious and beautiful and satisfying sort of way. And those were all of the tragic, upsetting, gut-wrenching, tear-jerking books I wanted to recommend today. Thank you guys so very much for watching this video. Thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting this channel. Take care, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.